Good morning, everybody. My name is Lance French. I'm the Business Development Manager for W&M Environmental, a division of Braun Intertech, and I would like to welcome you to our webinar on Lockout Tagout and Permit Required Confined Spaces. Our experts for today are W&M's Conan Reed and, back by popular demand, Nick Foreman. Thank you guys for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions, please send them to me through the chat tab on your GoToWebinar window. If we don't get to your questions, I will make sure that Conan and Nick get to them and answer them as soon as possible. We are recording this webinar, and it will be available to rewatch on our website tomorrow, along with the slides. And I will get an email to you with the link when they are made available. So let's get to it. Conan, Lockout, Tagout, and Confined Spaces. Program Misconceptions. Okay, so this is Conan Reed. He's our GPS. What is GSP? Sorry, what does GSP stand for?
Graduate Safety Practitioner.
All right, you need to speak up a little bit. So North Texas Industrial Project Manager. You have a BS in Occupational Safety and Health from Murray State. BS stands for Bachelor of Science, right? Not BS.
That is correct.
Okay, good. Okay, and he has been with 3 years with W&M. So Nick Foreman is the CSP, Certified Safety Professional.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I got that right. And he has a biology, BS in biology, Texas A&M.
Mm-hmm.
Whoop, big whoop. I'm just kidding. And master's in public health, and he's been with W&M for 12 years.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like 15, but I'm just kidding.
Some days.
All right, so Conan, I'm going to turn it over to you. Go for it. What are we looking at here?
All right. So one of the reasons why we're doing this is because a lot of OSHA's top 10 violations include lockout tagout violations, and they account for about 10% of all serious accidents, and it's the top 10 of most frequently cited citations that OSHA gives. And we've had clients recently that have been cited for lockout tagout, and this slide shows the other potential OSHA citations that you may encounter, but you could have falls, a HAZCOM. These are all top 10s. Respiratory protection would be one. Machine guarding, fork trucks, ladder safety. You've got PPE, and of course lockout tagout and training was the other one.
Yes. So one thing to remember here too is this list of top 10 changes every year.
Right.
You'll notice that lockout, tagout, and fall hazards and respiratory protection, they're on that list every single year. So it's definitely something OSHA's looking out for.
All right, sure.
Okay, so some of the misconceptions we've had is, companies thinking that they don't need a program because, they have contractors that complete all of their maintenance activities. So they say, hey, our employees don't do lockout tagout. We subcontract everything, and we have contractors that come out and do all our servicing and maintenance on our equipment. So therefore, we don't need a lockout tagout program. And that's kind of a misconception because you still need something in place to basically train your employees that you have at your facility so they understand what lockout tagout is. So you need to have those elements of a program and that program in place to do that. So you need to train your employees. You still, if you have employees that are working on that piece of equipment, those are classified as effective employees. So those employees are the ones that use that piece of equipment that the contractor may come out and do maintenance on. So they need to know not to remove a lock and tag and not to try to restart that equipment.
Okay, so I'm going to probably get some comments from the audience on this one, but can you explain to me or somebody who might not know what we're talking about lockout tagout means?
Well, lockout tagout is when you apply a lock and or tag to a piece of equipment to prevent that equipment from being restarted while somebody's performing some kind of servicing or maintenance on that equipment. So if that employee cannot maintain control of that equipment, someone else may be able to start up that equipment while they're working on it, and they may be in place where it puts them into an electrical hazard or some kind of machinery that could start up and hurt them or crush them or kill them.
Yeah, so the goal of Lockout Tagout is to de-energize a piece of equipment so that it can't get started up.
Right. The audience is probably rolling their eyes right now going, oh, come on. But
who let the business development guy talk?
Sorry.
Another misconception would be we don't use equipment for a long period of time. We can just use our Lockout Tagout lock and tag and just to shut down and prevent somebody from using that equipment. And that's kind of a misconception I see a lot, where I may go to a facility and you see something that's locked out and it's a piece of equipment, and the date on that tag and lock that they have is from 5 years ago.
That's if you can read it through the dust.
Yeah. And so that piece of equipment's been locked out for 5 years. Now, are they doing some kind of servicing and maintenance on that equipment? Well, in most cases, I would say no, because why is it down for that long? So what they're using is they're using that lock and tag as for out of service, but those need to be different from out of service, because it kind of it hurts the effectiveness of that Lockout Tagout program. So if you put your Lockout Tagout locks and tags on equipment, employees can kind of get used to that, and they don't treat it as something that's actually locked out, where somebody could be hurt if it was restarted or something. So what you can do is you can get an out of service tag, and you can use a different type of lock. You don't want to use the same one that you're using for Lockout Tagout to lock that equipment out, to prevent it from being restarted. Now, if you are going to be doing work on it and maintenance, then you would put it under Lockout Tagout, and that the person that is performing that service or maintenance on it would use their lock and tag. Another misconception is using the e-stops for Lockout Tagout. Many cases, employees may use e-stops to, when they're operating a piece of equipment, they may hit the e-stop, come over and reset it, or clear a jam or something of that nature. What that can do is, if they're putting parts of their body in a place where if that equipment gets restarted, they would be hurt by that sudden restart of that energy source, then they would need to have that equipment under Lockout Tagout and not use just an e-stop. So an e-stop they can use to temporarily, stop that equipment, because it doesn't disconnect the power from it. It's just a control circuit. It tells the equipment not to run. But if that employee then puts their part of their body in a place where if that machine was to restart, they could be hurt. Say another employee doesn't realize what they're doing and starts the equipment, that employee could be hurt or killed even. I had a visit with a client years ago that had an employee that was performing maintenance on a press, and he and the
this is not going to be a good story.
Maintenance guy were friends, and they worked together for a long time. And in what they had done, they had die blocks in place, but instead of using the die block, instead of using a Lockout Tagout, he just put the die block in place, which disconnected that equipment temporarily. And that maintenance guy went up on that piece of equipment and did his servicing, and he did not lock it out. He just did that, and the employee thought he was done and removed the die block and plugged it back in and restarted that equipment. Well, meanwhile, the maintenance guy had gone back up on the top of the press to check something, and the press was restarted and crushed him. Ouch. And it did kill him. So that is a case where they used kind of not necessarily an e-stop, but a control circuit. So that was a die block that had a disconnect on it. So when you unplugged it to put the die block in, it stopped the equipment, but the equipment was still not under Lockout Tagout.
And so I remember, I think it was a year ago, maybe a couple years ago, there was an accident in the food processing plant that I think they were cleaning it for maintenance and stuff. And somehow it got turned on. So somewhere along the line, the lockout tagout system broke down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And may even a confined space system with that.
Yeah, I think the issue there was more the confined space issue. I think he ended up having hazardous atmosphere, I think, was the main issue there.
I don't know. It didn't work out well either way. So, okay, you know what? I do have a question. Thank you, Nick. I do have a question for from our audience. What if I have a lockable e-stops? What if I have lockable e-stops?
So lockable e-stops can prevent that equipment from being restarted, and it doesn't de-energize the equipment. So if you're doing some kind of servicing or maintenance where your electrical work or something of that nature, if you use the lockable e-stop, it's not de-energizing all of those. It's just
Okay,
it's just
so
a control
lockable e-stop. So obviously you hit,
and it'll prevent.
and then you put a lock on it.
Yes.
Or how,
Either it's a lock and a tag that goes over it, so it prevents that e-stop from being reset, or
and what
the
you really
e-stop
want
itself
is
locked.
complete electrical
Isolation.
Okay.
There are cases where there's been control circuitry that can be shown that it is as effective as lockout tagout, but just by doing this doesn't mean that you're by adding a lockable e-stop, that particular piece of equipment that you have is going to fall under those means.
Yeah. The other thing too is you can have a couple different sources of electricity going to a machine, or a couple different power sources, and just by locking the e-stop doesn't mean that you're not getting power from somewhere else, where you end up in problems again.
Okay.
Yeah, that's where we talk about multiple energy source equipment. So you may have the equipment's powered by 480 volts of electricity, and there may be other like 110 volt control circuitry.
Yeah, that's a good point, because even though it's locked, you can still get electrocuted.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Good question.
This one here is kind of dealing with similar to what you were just asking, is interlock guards. So basically the interlocks, which is a machine guarding device that is used to prevent that equipment from, once that interlock is, you may open up a guard or a door and that interlock is broken, it stops and shuts down that equipment. But there's still electrical power being supplied to that, and it doesn't, it's not de-energizing the equipment. What it's doing is basically interrupting that control circuit and stopping it from starting again. And so it shouldn't be used as a means of lockout tagout. Like I said, there's been cases where you can have such fail-safe control circuitry that that they've shown for clearing certain types of routine operations. This may work, but it is a situation where you really do you want to take on that liability, because if it doesn't, you could have an employee that becomes hurt or killed, and there will be an OSHA citation for that.
I would think.
Mm-hmm. And then your equipment also can have that multiple sources of energy where that control circuit is just interrupting the power for that particular, maybe it's a press or something it's going to be a conveyor or something that it stops that, but it doesn't maybe interrupt. It's still got control circuits going to it and other types of electricity.
Okay, I have another question from our audience. Do I have to lock out cord and plug equipment?
Not all the time. So there could be instances where you have cord and plug equipment that it's the only energy source, and then you can think about your computer or a lot of your a blender or something small appliance that you may have, a refrigerator. You did work on it. You can unplug that, right? You can maintain control of that plug and not have to lock out that piece of equipment. However, if you have a larger piece of equipment that's cord and plug, and it may be 480 volt cord and plug or something like that, is much more electricity going to it, you may not be able to control that because that cord may be too short for that person that's working on it to have that cord close to them, or it may be on the other side of the equipment where they can't see. So someone may plug that equipment back in, it could be restarted, and they could be hurt or killed. And they do make lockout devices that would go over that plug to prevent them from using it and plugging it in.
Or the plug and the wall socket, or just the plug?
Just the plug would be.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes
Don't
sense.
unplug it and just stop people from putting it back into the wall socket. You want to make sure that plug is either in their control or it's got a cover on it to prevent it from being plugged in.
All right, very good. Another good question.
Okay, so this one talks about this misconception that only one person needs to lock out any piece of equipment or a machine as you're doing the maintenance work on it. So that's not true. You need to have everyone that's working on that piece of machinery lock out and tag out. And you can do that a couple different ways. You can have a hasp, which will have 6, 4, 10, however many holes in it that you need. And it will actually lock out that device by putting 6 different locks on it, or 10 different locks, whatever it is on there. You can see the picture over there in the bottom right corner. And
that's for one piece of equipment?
That's for one piece of equipment, but that means that there's 1, 2, 3, 4 people working on it.
Wow.
So, but the idea there is, again, you want to be perfectly safe with this stuff, right? It's dangerous. It's, heavy moving parts, equipment, hydraulics, all that kind of stuff, right? And if you don't have, so say you have a 4-man team and you've got 3 locks, then that 4th person, you don't want to be that 4th person, right? You want to make sure that your lock's on there so you're safe, because they can't operate that machine until it's locked out.
All right, see, I just got it there.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, well, I was thinking that would be a little bit overkill, but yeah, you don't want to be like 1, 2, and 3, they're done,
right?
And then you're like, okay, you're still working, and you didn't put your lock on, and
right.
Then they started up, and you're bye-bye.
Right. So you can do that with a hasp, or they have called lock boxes, where instead of actually using multiple different locks, you lock up all the keys. And so one person has the master key, and it goes into this lockbox, and then that one person puts the key to all of the other lockout tagouts in there. So they have to come get the key out of the box and unlock the key that's on the equipment or on the bottom of the box before they can do the equipment. So yes, it is. And unfortunately, you see it more often than not. Maybe not. You see it quite a bit where you'll have a team of people working on a piece of equipment and just one lock. And so you don't want to be the one that doesn't have the key if that's the case.
Right. And the group lockout box that he's talking about works well if you have, say, multiple places on a piece of equipment to lock out.
Mm-hmm.
And, each employee would have to lock out, and you'd have to have one of these hasps. You may have, say, 6 places to lock out on that piece of equipment. Well, then if you have 4 employees, you're looking at 24 locks for that equipment. Whereas if you use the lock box, you can put the 4 locks on that piece of equipment, and then put all the keys in the lock box, and then all the employees put their 4 locks on there. So you're now using 8 locks essentially,
instead of 24.
Instead of 24. So the keys to the ones that are on the equipment are in the lock box, and then they put their lock on that.
All right.
I really wish y'all could see Lane's face right now.
All right.
He's like, you got to do
hey,
what?
Safety is very important.
It is.
And
so there's a time and a place for each of those applications. Like Cohn said, if you've got more energy sources, it's easier to use a lockbox. If you've got just 1 or 2, a hasp is certainly easy to do. So another misconception that we see quite a bit is a lockout tagout lock has to be a keyed lock. It doesn't. There's not really, OSHA doesn't really have a definition of what a lockout tagout lock has to be. It has to be able to withstand 30 pounds of pull pressure, and then it needs to be identifiable, meaning you can use red locks, or you can use a certain color for your lockout tagout. It can be keyed, it can be a combination lock, it can be any type of lock, as long as it's identifiable as a lockout tagout lock. So when a lot of people prefer to use, and Amazon's probably a good advocate of this, they have the red lockout tagout locks that they're nice bright red. They're lockout tagout. But if you're at a facility and say your company colors are red and black and you've got red locks everywhere just for team spirit or whatever, you don't want to use red locks as lockout tagout because they almost kind of disappear in what you're doing.
Yeah, you don't want to
facility.
use orange at Home Depot.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So it doesn't have to be a keyed lock. It can be a combination lock. The bad part about that is, it has to be as effective as a keyed lock. Yes. So if you forget your combination, then you have to go through the whole procedure to what's the word I'm looking for?
Remove that lock. So you'll have to have a procedure in your program of removing the lock so you don't inadvertently start up that equipment with somebody working on it.
Yeah, the other thing too is with a keyed lock, it's really easy for one person to have one key. If you have multiple locks and you're trying to remember combination, each person should only have the combination to their locks. And so if that person forgets their locks, or if you're trying to use something like a lockbox and you're having to remember the combination, it gets more difficult whenever you have a combination lock versus a keyed lock. But it's kind of preference.
Yeah. And your manager cannot, or somebody you work with can't have that combination either.
So this is obviously it's really important for the workers who have these lock boxes that are assigned these locks. So is there pushback on using them? I mean, obviously there's violations and all over the place, and I'm sure a lot of it is because they didn't use their locks properly. I mean, is this a hard sell or why is this?
I've seen in facilities you go into, and those employees are assigned maybe a lock and tag, and they may have several, and sometimes you'll see them on their locker that they're using, and they may be they're color coded or whatever for lockout tagout. It says in many cases it'll be the ones from Brady or somebody that has it says for lockout tagout, has their name on the lock itself and do not operate, and they'll be using it for to lock something else up, and it shouldn't be. That's those are just for lockout tagout.
Okay, gotcha. All right,
and they can be any color; it doesn't matter. But whatever you guys decide to use, that is the only one for that purpose. So it can't be shared. So if you've decide, okay, we're going to use red master locks for lockout tagout, and then somebody orders a bunch of red master locks and starts using them for the lockers, or something else, then that's no longer identifiable as a lockout tagout lock. So you got to.
Okay, so Conan, you're out there in the field, and this is kind of what you look for and kind of what you do, right?
Well, if we're helping employees or a company out with that, I may see that and say, hey, this is not.
Yeah. So what are the most common? I don't know.
Some places I've seen where they've got the employees that are working on equipment, and they have a lock and a tag, and the equipment's locked out, and that employee for shift change goes and hangs his key in the breaker on a little key box holder. And he leaves, and his lock and tag is still on there, but his key's in there, so the next shift person can go take it off. And that's not effective control of that.
Yeah, that's not good.
Yeah, and so what you want to do is you could put that out of service on there, so you can still maintain control of that equipment. Put the out of service lock and tag.
Because there's no real reason to leave your lockout tagout lock when you're leaving a shift.
You should not leave it.
There's no reason for it.
Well, there may be that equipment is not finished.
So that's okay.
You're still working on that equipment. Okay. It's not done. The maintenance isn't finished. Right. So second shift maybe is going to finish that.
But at that point, what should happen is the guy takes his lock off, and then his replacement puts it back on.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
They have to, or some kind of shift change process for that.
Anything else? Kind of like. No? Good. All right. So now we're going into permit confined space program misconceptions. So permit confined. So I'm going to ask okay.
So go ahead.
I'll wait for my dumb question later. I'll let you go.
So I'm guessing you were going to ask what a confined space is or confirm
well,
a
what
confined
else?
space.
Yeah, let's, now that the what's confined space, then yeah, go ahead.
So I was anticipating Lance's question, which I said you can roll to the next slide is going to answer his question. So what is a confined space? And we're talking about, this is where we have a lot of clients, and a lot of people have some misunderstanding of what a confined space is. So a confined space is large enough for someone or an employee to bodily enter and perform assigned work. So they have to physically be able to get into that space and perform work. It's not designed for continuous occupancy, and it has a restricted means of entry and exit. So some of the misconceptions would be, if my space meets these three, is limited mean it only has one way in and one way out?
That was actually going to be my question.
Okay.
There you go.
Was that your question?
Well, yes, that was my question. Is that what a confined space is, to where you're limited to your escape route?
Not necessarily. So if you can imagine, lots of spaces have maybe one way in and one way out, but that does not necessarily make them. What if that way is a large doorway?
Yeah, like our office here.
Yeah.
It's got one way in, one way out, but it's not a confined space.
So because it was meant for continuous occupancy, right? So it doesn't meet that other definition. The office was meant for continuous occupancy. It's large enough for you to come inside and sit down and perform the work. A limited means of entry and exit would be, say that had a hatchway where you had to crawl inside or contort your body to get into that space. That would be a limited means of entry and exit.
So you might have 4 or 5 hatchways into a big confined space, but just because you have 4 or 5 doesn't mean that you have unlimited access in and out. You have to contort your body, bend certain ways, be slim enough, all that kind of stuff to get into that confined space.
Very good.
So what are we talking about? Well, I was going to go back to that.
Oh, sorry.
And it's, we have a definition for a confined space, but then a permanent required confined space is one that contains some kind of hazard in it or has characteristics. That could be an engulfment hazard, a hazardous atmosphere. It could be a configuration that could cause entrapment of somebody. So it had if you can imagine a hopper or something, or that somebody got into and they were to fall and it went to a smaller cross section that they could not either breathe, or they get trapped in that space. Or something that, there could be another serious safety hazard in there, some mechanical hazards, if go into tanks that have agitators in them.
Yeah, that's a common one.
Things of that, or fans even, would be a mechanical hazard that could cause serious injury but potentially death.
Yeah, and then the catch-all down there at the bottom is, they say, any other hazard.
Yeah. So any other recognized serious safety health hazard. So, and what they mean by those are hazards that would prevent somebody from, self-rescue, essentially. So if they were exposed to that hazard, they could be caught and trapped. It could be an atmospheric hazard. It could be something.
Poor ventilation?
Poor ventilation, exactly. That would be an atmospheric hazard that could prevent them from escaping. They go in and it has an oxygen deficient atmosphere. Okay, so this one is, my employees do not enter permanent required confined spaces. We use contractors, so I don't need a program. And so, yes, you still need a confined space program, even if you use the contractors to enter those spaces. And the reason is because you have to do assessments of those spaces, and then you've got to have some kind of element of a confined space program where you can inform those contractors of the hazards associated with those spaces. And then if you guys have procedures in place, you need to give those procedures to the contractor as far as hazards go. So you do those assessments, you can give the assessment to the contractor, and then you have to be able to coordinate your entry operations. So you may have employees that are working in an area near where those contractors are performing confined space work, and you wouldn't want those employees in that area where they could potentially enter that space. So that elements have to be in place, the training, that sort of thing, awareness level. And then you need to be debriefing with the contractor before, after they perform their work, they may have had issues and things like that. So in the future, you can be more safe.
Okay, I do have a question from the audience here. Okay. I got to get it out. Sorry. Would you treat secondary containments with 5-foot walls housing acid tanks as permit required?
So a secondary containment with 5-foot walls housing an acid tank as a permit required space. And in typical operation, I would think that space doesn't have necessarily a potential for a hazardous atmosphere. It meets the definition of a confined space if it's a ladder way or some way to get in and out of that. I'm not sure how that space would you would get in and out of it. So that's a restricted means. So it's a definition would be that limited means of egress and entrance, right? So if you had to use a ladder of something to get into that space, that would be your limited means of egress and entry. Is it designed for continuous occupancy?
Most containments aren't.
You may be designed to work in there, but not necessarily for continuous occupancy. And it's large enough for you to get in and perform work. So you can think of it kind of like a pit or something where you would, equipment housing pit. Now, does it have a potential to contain a hazardous atmosphere? Well, if it has an acid tank in there, if the tank is leaking, then yes. But normally no. And so that's one of those situations where you have to address it, and it could be a changing condition that would make a space permit required or non-permit based on the conditions of that space.
Okay, so let's just hypothetically, you go to his facility and you see this. What would you be looking for? What would be some of the things that would say, "Yep, that's what we got"? Or
well,
is it too hard to do a hypothetical on that?
Right. Well, we could, maybe there's just a ladder instead of a ladder way. You've got stairs to go into it. Does that maybe that doesn't have the limited means of egress and entry to get in and out? There's not as much of an issue with the stairs as it would be a ladder way getting in and out of there.
So it could still be
necessarily
a confined space, but not a permit required.
Space. Okay. But it could maybe not be a confined space based on whether or not your entrance and egress was a ladder or a stairs or how you're getting out of there.
Gotcha. All right. Hopefully, yes. I think I skipped a slide. Sorry.
And another thing is like you can prevent unauthorized access to an area and then assess it when you have, you can still put the permit required and then sign on there and then do a reassessment every time somebody goes in and do a, check for leaks and that sort of thing, and just have some kind of procedure in place to prevent somebody from going into that tank farm or whatever, that containment, so you don't have an issue where there would be a atmospheric hazard.
I think I'm at more than one slide. Do you remember where we were? I think I hit one slide and it jumped.
Go back one more.
One more, sorry.
No, go down.
Yeah, go back.
Oh,
you're going the wrong way.
Okay. Keep going.
Yep.
Sorry.
Okay. And this is where we left off, but I think we've done a pretty good job covering this.
Yeah.
You basically go back to the definition of what a confined space is and what a permit required confined space is. And if you have any of these conditions down here, these four these 4 conditions, then it's a permit required confined space.
Okay, I have one more question from the audience. This is good. I will have employees in a space that are working with chemicals.
Okay, so they may be bringing in hazards into that space. So your confined space, you may have assessed it, and it's a non-permit space. And if they're bringing in something that creates an atmospheric hazard, it can make it a permit space. And then you'll have to treat it as one. And so that means that, say they had to use the chemicals that they did were going to displace oxygen out. Then you've got to go in with a permit, and then use some kind of means to prevent, maybe forced air ventilation, something of that nature, to try to get those chemicals out of there while they're doing that work. And they may need respirators to perform that work safely. However, if the chemical use is fairly benign type stuff, and it's only going to maybe be above the permissible exposure limits, we're not talking about any kind of idle H issue, that doesn't necessarily make it a permit required confined space. You're looking at making a space, more of a hazard, but not preventing self-rescue. Their overexposure isn't going to kill them or prevent them from leaving the area. They may be exposed just above the permissible exposure limit, but not requiring a permit. So this would be an issue where, are those chemicals going to create a hazard that would make it an ideal H type atmosphere?
Okay, I have it's time for Lance's dumb question no, I guess not for the webinar. Probably asked already. But okay, so when you're in a confined space, you're sending in a worker in a confined space. Is there it may be a one-person job to get into the confined space, but is there a system in place where you have a monitor to make sure that person doesn't, because if you get into a tank or something and, is that really?
No, it's not.
All right,
that's probably one of the biggest hindrances that people have into entering their own spaces, is having their rescue team. So, and Conan knows more about this than I do, but anytime we start working on a project and we start talking about entering into one of these areas, we, first off, at WNM, we don't enter confined spaces. We just haven't. We never have. We've never had the equipment. We've never had all that kind of stuff. But it's a big deterrent to getting into a confined space, whoever it is. And so you have to have that in the back of your mind. How are you going to resolve these issues, and getting a rescue team and having what equipment you need on hand whenever you do this?
So yes, if you're having employees that work in confined spaces, they need to have the training. Now, if you're going into a non-permit space, you don't need rescue services. You don't need a entry team. That employee can do that work in a non-permit space. Now, if that employee brings in, like we talked about, those hazards, he can create a hazard in there that would potentially make it a permit space. So they need to have training to understand that, because that may reclassify that space from a non-permit to a permit. Now, if you're going into permit spaces, you need to have your entrant, you'll have your attendants and your entry supervisor. And also that entry supervisor can be the attendant, but they have to be outside that space the whole time. And you need to have rescue services. So whether you contract that out or you have an on-site rescue service.
Okay. Thank you.
Welcome.
For not making me feel dumb. So.
Okay, so I think we discussed this a little bit. The space has a potential to contain a contaminant above the OSHA PEL. Is this even a serious safety or health hazard? So, if it's above the permissible exposure limit, that doesn't necessarily make it a permit required space, because it's not preventing any kind of self-rescue. It's not. It's a HAZCOM, and more. It's covered under 1910 subpart Z with toxic substances and that sort of thing, but not necessarily making that a permit space. What would make it a permit space is if that chemical that they're bringing in or a contaminant is going to be above an ideal H atmosphere condition or potential to be, then that would make it a permit space.
Okay, I have a question from our audience. Utility vaults are inside our property line. Who is responsible for enforcing the procedures on confined space permit required?
So we've done a lot of assessments that are at facilities that have utility vaults in them. And we'll look at in most of the cases, your employees don't enter those utility vaults. It's going to be a contractor that comes out there. In most cases, it's going to be your electrical service contractors, telephone, and that sort of thing. If they're coming out and it is on your property, you still need to have some kind of knowledge of them doing that. And it may be on an easement and they own it and it's up to them. But if it's on your facility, you still want to do that. Now you can assess those yourself. When you do the confined space assessment, you can look and say, what hazards are in there. But that work you want to I would keep your employees out of there, and just know anytime those utility contractors came out to do that work. Right. And if your employees need to go in there because it's a phone system, then you really need to develop some procedures. There could be a lot of electrical lines in there that I've seen them fill with water and have a lot of high voltage stuff in there that could be an issue.
All right.
This one is, we don't need a program because our employees only enter non-permit confined spaces. And I thought we did cover this one earlier, but maybe not. So you still need to do a confined space assessment of your facility. So you don't necessarily have to have a confined space sign on every space, but you do need to have an assessment done to determine what spaces you have on site that are confined spaces and what are permit required confined spaces. And if you don't have employees entering in permit spaces, you need to have those marked or have some way to prevent them from accidentally entering them so they understand. So you can, and then as far as spaces being reclassified, you may have a lot of equipment or things that employees go into. I can think of air handlers and other things where employees routinely enter those spaces to perform work. So an air handler, in many cases, by definition, will be a confined space. And then if it has mechanical equipment in there, like rotating fan belts that are unguarded, rotating shafts, things where employees could come entangled or caught into that equipment, if they were to enter that space, then that would make it a permit required. And then you may have areas on that same piece of equipment that would be non-permit because it's an entry into an area that just has the filters and there's no mechanical equipment. Well, what you can do is have that part of your program where you've assessed that, and then they perform lockout tagout on that equipment and it can eliminate those hazards before they do that entry.
Yeah, but if you don't have the program to know to do that, then you're kind of hosed.
So those employees would need the lockout tagout training and then confined space training to understand how to eliminate those hazards. And then they have to document that those hazards are eliminated before they do that entry.
So this slide we put together just as a virtual demonstration of what all you might have to do to lock out and tag out, to enter a confined space. In this case, this under normal circumstances with chemicals in it and a mixer in there and all that kind of stuff, it would be a permit required confined space. But by eliminating all the hazards, they're able to enter it as a non-permit required confined space. So what they've had to do is, first off, that little vault right there, there's a mixer behind it. You can't see it, but there's a mixer behind it. They have to either remove that mixer so that they can't get pinched between the wall and the mixer. That's the ideal case. They can use it's not a chalk, it's not the word I'm looking for. But they can use a block, I guess, is what it is to do that. As long as there's no way for them to get caught in it still.
Yeah.
The easiest way is to remove it.
And that's where lockout tagout comes into play. So they would lock that mixer out to prevent it from being turned on. So they got it in there.
Yeah. So another thing that's, again, this is kind of specific to the scenario, but normal circumstances, this is connected to 2 or 3 other tanks. And so we don't want the liquids from the other tanks coming into this tank when we're working in it. So they physically disconnected it from the series of tanks when they were going to do this entry to clean it out, and they cleaned out the solvents, or they cleaned out the chemicals that were in there. They got all that kind of stuff. This has a steam jacket, so they disconnected the steam lines, made sure that there was no way that could be heating up while they were in there. They allowed the tank to cool to ambient temperature. I know a lot of times when production is number one, all that kind of stuff, you see that you've got a problem, you need to go and get into that tank, and it's a heated tank. A lot of times you don't think about making sure it cools down at time. But I guarantee if you're the one going in there, you're thinking about that, because we deal with we've dealt with a lot of clients that have hot tars or hot oils all the time, and whenever they need to clean those tanks out, it can take a full day to get those tanks down to ambient temperature. So another thing about all of this is you really want to kind of plan out your confined space entrances. You don't want them to be emergency entrances. Things don't tend to go as smoothly when it's an emergency situation. You want to try to plan them out as much as possible.
Okay, so Conan, I know I already asked you this, but so by definition, because that only has one entry, would that by definition be confined space?
So we were talking about that. So that space is a tank that is large enough for somebody to get inside and perform work, which meets the one definition. This is and. The limited means is a small hatchway that the person would have to crawl into. So that's restricted. And is it designed for you to be in there all the time? No, it's a tank, right? So it's got a chemical process going on in there. So that's not designed for
So if that thing had 2 or 3 entrances or exits, it would still probably be a confined space.
Okay, confined space.
You still got to contort your body.
Even if it was, say that was, and I don't know how big that is. It looks like it's probably 4 foot.
All right.
Yeah, somewhere
like
around there.
So.
Yeah, so this is one of the things, as you're reclassifying or as you're looking at your confined spaces in general, as you're building your program, you want to have a confined space permit, or I guess this is all about your confined spaces. So we set these up for permit required and non-permit required. It gives you all the hazards, all the potential hazards. It talks about what you have to do to isolate your energy sources, all that kind of stuff. So again, this is something that we do for confined space, permit required and non-permit required. And it just details what you would have to do to enter this space. And if it is, I guess if you go to the next slide, it'll tell you, okay, so this is a permit required confined space, and we're going to have to do air monitoring in this because it had a chemical in it, or it has the potential for us bringing chemicals into it. Then you're going to have to monitor for these certain things every so often, and this is where this acts as your permit too.
This is your permit, and it's got a place for the air monitoring that he's talking about on here.
So when Conan and I go out to sites, and we've got other safety guys here, W&M for sure, when we go out to sites, we see a lot of these things, and so we wanted to kind of nip them in the bud a little bit as much as we could. But we see the more and more that people know. I mean, a lot of times the lockout tagout misconceptions are just because people haven't been formally trained like they should, and that kind of stuff. So the more information that your employees have on this material, and the more frequently you follow up with your employees and say, hey, what's the protocol? Ask them individually periodically, hey, what's the protocol on this? What's the protocol on this? The more you engage them and the more you follow up with them, get them the training that they need, it seems to be that, obviously the better they'll perform in this material, this environment.
And there are training requirements as well as annual program reviews. So, for lockout tagout, you want to review your employees performing the lockout on an annual basis to make sure that they understand the procedures. And in many cases, something could have changed, and those procedures may be deficient, and then you're identifying that and taking care of it then.
Yeah. So this is, I thought this was funny as we were putting together the slides. Just for giggles, I was like, okay, let me just Google permit required confined space. Let me just Google non-permit required confined space. And these 4 pictures were 4 of the, I bet, top 10, 15 question or images that popped up whenever I searched non-permit required confined space. So you can't always trust Google.
Because all those guys are in permit required spaces.
Yeah, so
they're all in
supply
air.
Yeah, that's a.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously the internet is a powerful source. It does a lot of good things, but at the same time, you can't always trust it. So, this is the whole marketing spiel.
You can't
of it.
always trust the internet. That's going to be. Write that down, everybody.
That's new. I just
So
I saw that on the internet, so it's true. So,
all right. Well, I do have a couple questions from the audience. Is there a specific training requirement for employees for non-permit?
So your non-permit space employees that are enter those would still need to have confined space permit training, and the reason is they need to know. That yes, you could potentially make that space permit required based on the type of work. So maybe that employee went into a confined space, a tank that, you guys assessed it as a non-permit space, and
you're welding.
Yeah. He's doing welding in there, and then he's generating enough weld fume and carbon monoxide to make it a hazardous atmosphere that, he could die in there if he wasn't familiar. So yes, they still need to have the training. Now, they don't have to have, when you're doing non-permit entry, you don't have to have a rescue team. So the whole idea of confined space entry is let's eliminate the hazards if we can and make it a non-permit so we don't have issues. You don't have to have the rescue team. You don't have to have a confined space entry team.
So if somebody's out there listening and they haven't. Well, hey, we still have if you're still awake after all this, and they're going, oh, is that something that you can help them get a program together, or
we write lots of programs, do
download on Google.
And yes, you don't necessarily have to have us come and write a program for you. You can put together your own
don't
confined
go
space
to Google,
program.
right?
You can get them from OSHA's got some example programs and that sort of thing. And you can probably find Google and find some. Just want to make sure that if you do that, go through it and review it to make sure that you're getting a program that's compliant.
Okay. Last question is, this is going to be long. My employees enter a permit required confined space. We don't have a rescue team. Can we call the local fire department?
Well, the answer to that is yes, and there is some caveats.
Don't call the milkman.
So you can use the fire department as your rescue service, but don't rely on them and hope that the first time you call them is the time you need them to come rescue, and they don't know about your site or about anything on there, because when they come out, they may be it may not be a rescue, it may be a recovery. So what you want to do, if you're going to use the local fire department to be your rescue service, you need to coordinate with them ahead of time and find out how long it's going to, if they can even come out there in a reasonable amount of time if you did call them. And then if they can even do that, in some cases, fire departments may not be able to. They may not have the services to do that. So then you may need to get an outside rescue service when you do those entries.
And you never know, timing wise, how you could be time limited or time you have a time restraint.
And
they could too. They could be off fighting a fire, and you're like, oh well, we were hoping.
And before you, and if you're going to use them before you do an entry, and if they say yes, you need to let them know so they're on kind of a standby situation before you do an entry. So a lot of the fire departments I know that will perform this, they love it. They'll come out and they love to do the training on your site. They'll use your facility to do their training. They'll train their guys there, and it becomes a situation where you can have some real involvement with your local EMS people. So
that'd be good. All right, guys. Thank you very much for that webinar. I learned a lot. So I don't know if anybody else did, but I did learn a lot. So I know that I will not be going into any confined spaces, permit or no. So I will tell you that. So if you want to contact Conan, here is his contact information, and as well as Nick. Thank you guys. I know it's Nick's favorite to do these webinars, and Conan, you did a great job. So I wanted to just take a minute and say that our next webinar is in May 30th. It's in soil and groundwater remediation technology selection. And David McAllister from our Fort Worth office is going to be here, and as well as maybe some special guests from Kansas City. So
great.
Thank you guys for joining us. And again, we will be getting these slides and the recording out to you guys. I will probably have it on the webinar tomorrow, so look in your email for the special link. Have a great day.
Thanks. Go Stars.
Thank you.